I want us all just to situate ourselves back in time. We're going to go back to the 20th of April, 1650. It's the dead of night in the parish church of the Blessed Virgin in St. Mary's, in the centre of the high town of Kilkenny. All around, we hear the sounds of the rampaging Cromwellian army who've overrun the city, which is then in the grip of famine. It's in the grip of defeat, of plague, and we've got the smell of fire and gunpowder and death everywhere. And in the relative quiet of the Rothe Chantry chapel of St. Michael the Archangel in the north transept of St. Mary's, on a bier surrounded by burning torches, a bit like in this wonderful painting by Andrea Sacchi from 1640. On the bier, surrounded by burning torches, lies the lifeless body of the most famous Catholic churchman of the 17th century and the spiritual leader of the Kilkenny Confederation, the 82-year-old Bishop David Rothe. With the tacit acquiescence of the Cromwellian enemy who had taken his life as he escaped the city, his friends and his family, they attend his mortal remains throughout the night, performing the office of the dead. Before his burial at dawn, as he requested himself, in the tomb of his ancestors. And this is the tomb vault in which David Rothe was interred on the 20th of April, 1650. As it was rediscovered in the archaeological excavations that myself and my team undertook in St. Mary's between 2015 and 2017, in tandem with the conversion of the old parish church into the new medieval mile museum for the city. We see the altar, called a predella. This is where Rothe's bier, which was surrounded by the torches, undoubtedly was sited in 1650. It's surrounded by the exquisitely carved altar tombs. You can see some of them there. Topped off by the great Renaissance mural tomb of Richard Rothe from 1637. We go down the steps that received David Rothe's coffin, and we enter the burial vault. What do we find there? We find a stack of collapsed timber coffins within the barrel vaulted stone room, essentially. We find the coffins, but also neatly stacked bones, skulls, long bones along the walls of the vault. We find little piles of charcoal in the corners as well, which almost certainly used by the undertakers to remove the smells, burning wood to remove the smells during interments. The final coffin that had been placed in the stack within the Rothe burial vault, it's of pine. It's very narrow at its base, and it's got these very fine iron fittings. And inside in this coffin, are the remains of an elderly woman. She's buried in a cross shroud. There's her skull. There's the coffin. The coffin had been broken open in antiquity. Her skull, and you can see here her shroud with a ribbon cross emblazoned onto the shroud. We also had traces of textiles on her skull, which indicates that she may have worn some sort of a bonnet. Her legs were clad in very, very fine French silk burial stockings, the sort of stockings that would be seen in the court of Louis XIV of France. This type of attire, very typical from the late 17th century, early 18th century, when death was seen as the long sleep. And this is a depiction of grave robbers removing somebody from their grave in 1755. And you can see this woman is dressed in night attire with a night bonnet, which would have been very, very similar, I think, to what this individual wore to her death. The lid of her coffin is decorated with these very fine bronze upholstery nails, and they form initials. And you can see there's a C, and an A, P, and a bit of a 1, 7. And that's on the coffin lid. And then the actual coffin itself is wrapped in a very fine woolen textile. And here is a reconstruction of the coffin in its entirety. And it reads CR, April 13th, 1714. And you can see here, this is the reconstruction of the coffin with its lovely iron fittings. Very, very narrow at the end. So who is this? This is the remains of Catherine Rothe, Archdeacon. And incredibly, as a young woman, she is recorded as having held the hand of David Rothe as he lay dying at his childhood residence beside the Tolsel there on High Street in April 1650. Now, we didn't disturb any of the coffins here. We recorded everything that was there. And whether or not the remains of one of Kilkenny's most famous sons, David Rothe, still lies here within the vault, hopefully undisturbed. Whether or not that is the case, we're not sure. It's a tantalizing mystery for another day, I think. But I would strongly suggest that his remains are in the burial vault. So the church that David Rothe was buried in, St. Mary's, this served most of the people of the high town of Kilkenny. So in the parish of St. Mary, which was carved out of the larger parish originally of St. Canice, that's the yellow here, there's the town walls. And you can see the yellow area is the parish of St. Mary's, and it encompasses most of the walled area, apart from this little bit over here, which was served by St. Patrick's Church over here on the east side of the walled city. The population of the parish of St. Mary's, those people who would have used the church at the height of the Middle Ages, Kilkenny by the mid to late 13th century is the largest inland town in Ireland. It's a booming success. There probably would have been, I reckon, between all the burgage plots, the families, and then the people who lived in the suburbs outside the walls within the parish here as well, out near James's Green and over towards Walking Street here. I think you're probably looking at about 1,500 individuals. So that's a lot of people for one church. The church itself was built in the first years of the 13th century. We don't know precisely when it was built. It's very hard to work out. The first record we have of it dates from between 1202 and 1205, when there's a court held in the church. So it must have been finished by then. My own suspicion is that it dates from roughly around 1200 or so. And it was built by none other than the great Norman magnate William Marshall, who is the Lord of Leinster. He is the Earl of Pembroke, and it's built to serve the spiritual needs of his colonists in his capital of his lordship of Leinster. So he builds the church in the early 1200s. By 1207 then, the church he transfers to the Dean and Chapter of St. Canice's Cathedral. So 1207, the church is transferred to the Dean and Chapter of St. Canice's Cathedral as part of a land swap deal, basically, between church and state, the secular and church authorities at the time. So the purpose of the parish church of St. Mary is to serve the people, their spiritual needs of the people of the parish. And in return, they then have to pay for it by way of tithes, and the merchants and the corporations of the town, they pay tithes to the clergy. They pay an annual rent for its running, its upkeep, for the candles, for the payment of the clergy and the chaplains and the clerks of the parish church. So that's the deal. Now, at the Tudor Reformation, then, St. Mary's passes to the established church. But because Kilkenny, it was one of the most staunchly Old English Catholic towns in Ireland at the time. And a very curious thing happens in St. Mary's. We have something happening that would be absolutely unthinkable in Reformation England at the time, for example. So Catholic and Protestant worship coexisted within the body of the church. We have Protestant worship taking over the nave, and then Catholic worship and burial and the chantry chapels continue to operate in the side chapels that are in the transepts and in the chancel. So it's a very, very strange setup, and it's something that is not quite unique, but in Ireland. We do have other examples of it, but it's one of the very few examples of it. And I suppose it speaks to the power of the Old English Catholic oligarchy who ruled Kilkenny at the time. Now, at this time, between the mid-16th century and the early 17th century, we find there is absolutely enormous investment by the merchant oligarchy in the church, in its chantry chapels, in its burial monuments. These are memorializing the post-Reformation Catholic dead of the city. They endow the church richly. Some of the explanation for that may be that much of their prior investment might have been in the monasteries, which had been closed in the town, and they moved then their investment, their endowments into St. Mary's after the Reformation. So the upshot of this is that it has bestowed on us one of the largest and the most cohesive collections of late medieval, early modern tomb monuments in the entire country. And you can see here the lovely Walsh Lawless tomb from 1573, which is in the Bryan Vault at St. Mary's. Very typical tomb from the period. It's an altar tomb, and it's emblazoned with the symbols of the Passion, lovely carvings. This is the work of the Kerran School of Monumental Sculptures. We find tombs such as the great monument to Sir Richard Shee, who died in 1608. He's a lawyer to the Butlers of Ormond. He's a politician. He's the Deputy Lord Treasurer of Ireland for a time. We'll come back to him again in a minute. And By this time in the early 1600s, we see Renaissance influences being brought to bear on the architecture of the tombs. The most beautiful of them all, I would suggest, is the tomb of the man who built with his wife this house here, John Rothe Fitzpiers. He died in 1620, and there's his tomb in St. Mary's. You can see it's got an altar at the bottom, and then this very Renaissance style canopy over the altar, and it's completely covered in Catholic symbolism. And beside it then, we have the tomb of Richard Rothe, who dies in 1637. This one, you'll notice, doesn't have Catholic symbolism on it. It's a very Protestant-looking tomb, in fact, but we know that Richard Rothe himself wasn't a Protestant, but maybe he was keeping a foot in both camps here, just to be sure. So that's what's happening in terms of investment in the church in that really, really important period between the end of the Reformation and, in the run-up to the Great Rebellion and then the Cromwellian attack. And at the outbreak of the rebellion in 1641, St. Mary's it's reconsecrated as a Catholic church, and it remains so throughout the Confederate period up until the Cromwellian conquest and assault and attack on Kilkenny in March 1650. At that point, once Cromwell takes over Kilkenny, one of the very first things he does is he installs a Baptist church in St. Mary's. And we never knew about this until quite recently, but there's records of this have turned up there in the representative church body that describe a Baptist church in St. Mary's for quite a short period of time, maybe a year or two after 1650. Now, what happens then is a new parish church of St. Mary's is founded for the Catholic population outside, but this time outside the walls of Kilkenny in around 1678. And here it is marked as St. James's Chapel on Roke's map of 1758. The original St. Mary's Chapel outside the walls was built around 1678, and then it was rebuilt and rededicated in 1700. But despite the fact that there is a Catholic church at the disposal of the Catholic parishioners of Kilkenny, they still bury their dead, a lot of them in St. Mary's, in the old original St. Mary's. And we saw it with Catherine Rothe. She dies in 1617. She's still buried in the old family mortuary chapel inside in the church. You can see there, there's an enormous connection between the Kilkenny families, the great Kilkenny families, the Rothes, the Shees, the Archers, with their old church. And it withstands the Reformation, and it continues right up until at least the late 1600s, early 1700s. The large church then at St. Mary's was no longer needed for the quite, modest enough Protestant population in the town. And so what happened was the chancel and the side aisles are eventually taken down between 1739 and 1748. And this is to convert the church for Protestant use. It's to convert it into what's called a prayer book church, where the sound of the preacher who's up in his pulpit within the nave of the church, can, cover the entirety of the congregation quite easily. In the old medieval church, you've got these great big vast spaces. You have the services are happening, the mass is happening in this great big long chancel, and this was no longer needed for Protestant use. And you can see on Roke's map here, 1758, The side aisles are gone, and the chancel is gone. Okay, and then this is the first accurate map that we have of it. And you see this building here, which is down at the west end of the nave. That's the old belfry tower, which was built in 1343. And this was a really important landmark on the Kilkenny skyline. And any images that we have from before 1819, when it was taken down, tend to show it on the skyline. The famous Pratt view from 1700, isn't it? Shows it there. You can see there's the great belfry tower of St. Mary's in the middle of his view there. So this was taken down in 1819, and it was replaced by the current west steeple tower, which was built by the famous evangelist Peter Rothe, whom Seamus here. Seamus gave a marvellous lecture on Peter Rothe there a number of years ago. One of the things we looked at in our archaeological excavations were the foundations of this great belfry tower. We opened up the area here, and you can see the rectangular foundations of the tower. So we revealed the foundations of the 14th century steeple in the excavations. You can see them there. Very, very tightly packed, really robust foundations. No messing around with these. They were designed to take a massive structure. We reckon that the tower was around the same height as St. Canice's tower originally. So you're talking about 30 metres or so in height. This was a really enormous structure. Now, throughout the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, we find there's a general trend for a decline in the Protestant population of the town. And this eventually leads in 1951 to the final service in the church. And you can see here, these are some photos that were taken around that time of the inside. That's looking towards the east end of the church, and that's looking towards the west end. So you can see there was an organ loft and a heating system here up through the... So those photos reflect that period. It's deconsecrated at this time, and it becomes St. Mary's Hall, then a parish hall, where I'm sure many of you were at lots of art exhibitions, and many of you might have played badminton inside in the hall. Apparently it had the best sprung badminton floor in the country. And I remember the day we were ripping it up. There was a few people that weren't too happy about that. So that all happened in 1964, when the place was converted into a parish hall. There was a period then, I suppose, in the 1990s into the early 2000s then, when the church, and particularly its graveyard, underwent severe dereliction, vandalism, etc. You can see some of the tombs. This is the tomb of Elias Shee, which was really, really badly damaged by vandals back in the 90s. There's a fella here, even left the date, thank you, 1993. And this is one of the 17th century tombs in the east end of the church, belonged to Thomas Shee. You can see his lead coffin here has been broken open, and they've tried to get in at the remains. There was a big campaign here locally. Myself and a lot of people, including the Kilkenny Archaeological Society, An Taisce, the Heritage Council, and various politicians as well, were heavily involved in it. And this eventually led to the purchase of the site by Kilkenny County Council in 2009. The idea was to purchase the site, start off with conservation of the tombs, and then repurpose it into a civic museum, which became eventually known as the Medieval Mile Museum. So the first thing was the conservation of the tombs, and I'm delighted to see Dr. Amy Harris here this evening, who I worked very closely with on this project where we were trying to conserve and restore the tombs to something akin to their former glory. So you can see here, there's the tombs back. This is around 2005, and then this is 2011, where we've restored the tombs. And there was smashed pieces of these funerary monuments strewn all over the graveyard, and we managed to find most of them. We had to use a few blanks to fill the spaces, and then we also restored and conserved this little mausoleum building here called the Shee Mausoleum. So these are all still nicely conserved. The idea then was to build a new museum building, and this was designed by the architects Neil McCullough from McCullough Mulvin, who sadly passed away there a couple of years ago. Real visionary architect who brought something very special to this particular project. From my perspective, he was an absolute joy to work with, because he's one of the very first architects I've ever worked with who was delighted when I found something. Most of the time it spells, they scratch their heads and go, how are we going to get rid of this archaeology or archaeologist? Or how are we going to design or do thing around it? So, but Neil was different. He very much wanted the archaeology to inform the design of the new building, and also to integrate archaeology into the final building. So as part of that process then, we spent about 2 years excavating here in advance of the museum's construction. We excavated about 70% of the floor area of the original medieval church. That's all that green area there. There's the plan of the church as it is today. That area, about 70% of it was excavated. Now, this wasn't excavated down to, the level of the natural ground. This wasn't about removing archaeology. We excavated between 70 centimetres and about a metre down to accommodate things like museum substructures and underfloor heating, service trenching, that sort of thing. Now, inside in the church, the level of the preservation of archaeology was quite extraordinary. And this is because when the wings of the church were removed, when the chancel was demolished, all of the rubble from that was simply piled up inside in the remainder of the church. So it was piled up in the nave and in the transepts. And effectively what this introduced was a metre or so of clay and rubble that perfectly preserved the medieval levels of the church. And our job throughout most of the excavation was to remove that rubble and come down onto the pre-introduction of that material floor levels, which had pretty much remained the same throughout the medieval and early modern period. And that meant it wasn't just, the floors and burials and things like that were preserved, but also tomb sculptures, like this one here, perfectly preserved underneath the rubble. You can see this is the tomb, the altar tomb of Walter Archer from 1575. So it was an absolutely extraordinary moment, I think, when we realised, myself and Philip down the end there, I remember it well, when we realised what exactly was happening here, that we had effectively a little Pompeii under all of that rubble from the 18th century. The excavations that we undertook here are the most extensive that were ever undertaken in an Irish medieval parish church. And the discoveries that I had the immense privilege of being involved in will I think stay with me for the rest of my life. They're largely intact chantry chapels from the great Kilkenny merchant families. We have, as I mentioned already, we have funerary sculptures. We have burial vaults filled with the wonderful timber, iron fitted coffins. We investigated about 180 graves. 42 skeletons were investigated, and about 4,500 artefacts were retrieved. An enormous collection of architectural and carved stones from tomb monuments were also recovered. And once we went off site, we then start into a whole new process of discovery. Now, I spoke to this society very shortly after we had just come off site back in, 2016, I think. And I was talking then about the stuff that we had found in the excavation. But now, since this, and then we've gone into this completely new phase of discovery, what we call post-excavation. It really is the gift that keeps on giving. We've done an enormous amount of scientific analysis on all of the material that we've excavated. We have a whole range of radiocarbon dates that give us a very tight chronology on the excavated material. We've done scientific analysis, isotopic analysis of the human bone that gives us really interesting results, tells us about diet and the modes of life of people at the time. We've done detailed osteoarchaeological study of the human remains. All the artefacts have been studied, drawn, photographed, catalogued, and a huge 2-volume report has been completed and lodged with the National Monument Service. The next stage is to publish that, and we're in the process of trying to get that off the ground at the moment. So what I'm going to speak to you about, and you're the first people that will be hearing most of this, is I'll be talking to you about some of these new results from the post-excavation analysis. And one of the things we also did, just before I get onto that, is most of the internal walls were stripped and the external walls were also raked out. And there was always a bit of a mystery about exactly how much of the medieval church actually survives upstanding there at St. Mary's. St. Mary's is a building that doesn't really give its secrets out easily. You know, it's not like St. Mary's in New Ross or Dunbrody Abbey or something where there's very distinctive architectural styles, like very finely carved, stiff leaf Dundry work and that kind of thing from the early English Gothic. But St. Mary's doesn't really have that. So it's a difficult church to kind of work through to figure out the phasing of it and the origins and architectural development of it. So once the walls were stripped and all the joints raked out on the exterior walls as well, this gave us an opportunity to have a look at that particular problem. And what we found was that really only about half the medieval building survives upstanding. That's all the light blue walls there. There's the plan of the church there. So can you see? There's the nave aisle columns, pillars. And then you've got some of the wall of the north transept and some of the chancel. Simplified plan, the black there is the medieval masonry that still survives upstanding. And here it is in elevation, this beautiful drawing that Phil Kenny did of the phasing of the church, all the different elevations. The blue there is the medieval fabric. So you can see the 18th century was not kind to St. Mary's. The whole crossing was completely rebuilt. Most of the south transept was rebuilt in the mid-18th century as well. And then the nave arches were all infilled around the same time. But when you look at it in the kind of detail that we had the opportunity to look at it, and then we bring in all the archival sources, so the early maps and written records and so forth, there is actually enough there to allow us to understand its medieval form. And this is a plan of how it would have looked in around 1350 or so. So there's the nave aisle pillars that I was talking about, big long chancel, north transept, south transept, and there's the northwest tower. There was 2 porches opposing sides of the nave. So it's a massive parish church by Irish standards. It's about 1,000 metres square in area. It's one of the largest parish churches in the country that we have. I think it's second only to St. Mary's in New Ross, actually. And in that, it's very much reflecting the ambitions of its founder, William Marshall. He has great ambitions for his town, and he builds a massive parish church to satisfy those. The church itself then is set within a very large churchyard, which becomes the main burial place for the medieval population of Kilkenny. And if you go there today, you'll see that there's the graveyard is surrounded by stone masonry walls. But in fact, the original medieval graveyard extended much, much further out towards the High Street, towards Kieran Street. And every time, somebody is digging up on St. Mary's Lane, they tend to find human remains there, only a foot or so under the ground. Now, I've mentioned these things called chantry chapels a few times. It's definitely one of the highlights of the excavations that we did at St. Mary's, was this really rare opportunity to excavate in a number of these Catholic chantry chapels. We have records of about a dozen of them from the church. This map here shows where we can place them. The Knaresborough Chantry, the Shee Chantry at the east end, which occupies the Lady Chapel. We have the Archer Chantry to St. James in the south transept and so forth. But these are the ones that we can actually locate on a plan. We have records of about 6 or 7 others that we're not quite sure exactly where they were. They were probably in the nave aisles here on either side, and that was generally the key purpose of introducing these wings to a medieval church. So what are chantries? Well, chantries are really, really essential to understanding the development of church and how it was used. They were a response to the fear that every medieval person felt about what would follow their death. They were absolutely, people in the Middle Ages and the early modern period in Ireland were completely preoccupied with what happens on their death. They weren't too worried about the actual death itself. It was what went after it was the big unknown. The medieval Christian faithful believed that for those who could escape hell after death, their souls had to be purified of all of the accumulated sins of a lifetime in purgatory before they could enter heaven. And every person in the Middle Ages believed that they had to spend quite a long time being purged of the sins of a lifetime in purgatory. So that this doctrine of purgatory absolutely dominated belief systems at the time. That after death, the soul enters this liminal place between heaven and hell, where all of those sins are purged before ascent, as is shown in this lovely illustration, before they're getting purged down here in purgatory, and then they ascend to the salvation of heaven in a bucket, where they find a state of grace. And we have descriptions of what people at the time actually thought purgatory comprised of. Very detailed and vivid descriptions, loads of them. For example, we have the 12th century legend of the purgatory of St. Patrick in Lough Derg, which describes purgatory as an infernal pit, a vast gulf, dark and emitting an intolerable stench, and full of screaming and howling. By the pit was a serpent of infinite magnitude, bound by a great chain. Before the mouth of the serpent stood a multitude of souls, which he sucked in like flies as each breath, and then with the return of respiration, blew them out, scorched to sparks, and this process continued till the souls were purged of their sins. So you can see, it's little wonder people are a bit, in the reading this sort of stuff, they're a bit concerned about the afterlife. And they want to do absolutely everything they possibly can to lessen the amount of time they have to spend in purgatory after their death. And there were things that could be done. Like everything else, though, in the medieval world, and I suppose in our world too, it depends on your wealth and standing. So if you're an ordinary peasant, you might expect to have a taper burning on an altar within the parish church for maybe one day a year. And that might get you 6 or 7 days remission from purgatory. And purgatory can last thousands and thousands of years. Now, if you're a wealthy merchant, you can build effectively a gateway to heaven by paying for a chantry chapel in a parish church, but also in an abbey or in a cathedral in some cases. So they're purpose-built chapels where a priest or chaplain is actually paid to chant, that's where the word comes from, a set number of masses for the salvation of the soul of the benefactor in purgatory. So that's their job. They have to say at least 2 masses a day, matins and evensong. And the more masses and prayers that are said, the less time he or she has to spend in purgatory. So there's really extraordinary lengths are gone to at the time to ensure the soul is remembered by the families, and that as many prayers as possible are said, as many thoughts are given towards the deceased. And the Mass had a very special potency within that belief system. The Mass, it was all worked out. The Mass gave you something like 2 years off your time in purgatory. And a Mass that was said on top of your actual burial place gave you, I think it was 4 or 5 years off. So people wanted to be buried as close as possible to where the chantry Mass would be said. And that's why, one of the reasons why we find tombs like the Walsh Lawless tomb I showed you earlier on, why they are constituted as altars, so that the chantry priest could say the Mass on top of the tomb. And it's why they're covered in religious symbolism as well. They're reminders of the piety of the individual, but they're also there to attract the prayers of random passer-bys. So somebody who's passing by will stop and say a prayer at your tomb because it has a depiction of your favourite saint on it. And that gives you remission from purgatory, but it also gives the person who has prayed something back. They can clock up a few days off as well as they're going by. And we actually, there's a tomb in St. Canice's Cathedral to Bishop Tobin from 1574, I think, where it actually specifies in the inscription that if you pray for me, you will be granted 2 years of indulgences. So it's extraordinary just how powerful this was, and it's the materiality of it that I'm particularly interested in how it, what's the physical form of this belief system, and how, and we can see that in the archaeology of the Church of St. Mary's in particular. Now, a typical chantry chapel, it was screened off from the rest of the church. And you can see here, this is the 15th century pre-Reformation Bishop Fox Chantry Chapel in Winchester Cathedral. Now, this is a very, very fine. I doubt there was anything much like this anyway in Kilkenny at the time. It was probably wooden screens and maybe smaller scale masonry screens like this. These were called part close screens. And they basically sectioned off a part of the church. And it was within that then that you would find the funerary monuments, the altar. They often had a little thing called a squint, which it was a little gap in the stonework that gave you a view of the high altar of the church, so that you could keep an eye on the services on the high altar as well. So with the Reformation, then what was called this vain and superstitious devotional tradition of purgatory, it was outlawed in the stroke of a pen. And this was an absolutely enormous rupture for the people of medieval Ireland. It broke that thread that bound the living to the dead, and the living, through their prayers and through their actions, could no longer help the dead in purgatory. So you can see how this must have been absolutely calamitous for the people at the time. Edward VI, 1547 Chantry Act dissolved all of the chantries in England and Wales and Scotland. For some reason, and we don't quite know why actually, this act didn't apply to Ireland, but we still find lots and lots of these chantries are dissolved in the country. We do find, like in St. Mary's, that the institutions, they continue in use in some parish churches, occasionally monasteries as well, despite the monasteries haven't been dissolved, and this keeps going in some cases well into the 1600s. If we look around the place for physical evidence of chantry chapels today, there's not a whole lot left. And it wasn't the Cromwellians that did away with them. It was mostly the Victorians, I think, that tore down whatever remained of the chantry chapels in the old medieval churches in the country. So there is quite a bit. I've been collating a list of all of the chantry chapels that I can identify that have upstanding physical remains, and I think there's about 30 or 35 of them. St. Nicholas's in Galway now has a good bit of physical evidence still for chantry chapels in the form of tombs, squints and things like that. And in the Shee Chantry Chapel in Tullerone is another good example of one. So I think there's a great study to be done there of these particular foundations, and I hope I've gotten it across to you just how important they were in the medieval world. So let's have a look at what we found in the chantry chapels in St. Mary's. Now, the first one we've already visited. It's the chapel of St. Michael the Archangel, situated in the north transept of the church. It had its own private entrance coming off here. And this was endowed by the Rothe family from around the mid-1500s. So just after the Reformation, they set up this chantry chapel here. And again, I wonder, did they already have an earlier chantry in one of the monasteries in town, maybe in the Franciscans, and then they moved to this place here. When we lifted up the floor and removed the rubble infill that I was telling you about, this was all dumped in the 18th century, we found these absolutely exquisitely carved altar tombs set up against the north wall of the north transept. We also found this ledger to one of the Shee family from 1634. This is lying on the floor, and another image of us excavating in the chantry here. And there's the side of the predella, but you can see clearly where that was the floor level before we started, and the rubble was occupied about a metre depth here. So that was all taken out, and lo and behold, we get the tombs, the medieval floor level, burials, the altar here, the predella, and then this is the one that was covering the Rothe burial vault that I showed you earlier on. The tombs themselves, there's a plan of it here. These three tombs up against the north wall, for example, the one of John Rothe Fitzrobert, who died in 1590 in the centre here, and then lots of burials here from the 18th and 19th century that kind of peppered the floor. There's the tomb of John Rothe Fitzrobert, and this decorative motif here might reflect what the chantry screens would have looked like, back at the time. There's a scan of the top, the mensa of the tomb. You can see beautifully carved with eight-armed cross. We've got the shaft there, and coming down to a depiction of the Hill of Calvary here at the bottom. And then the big long inscription about how great they all are in Latin on the tomb. And you get things like this, the Marian symbol here, which is reflecting their devotion to Our Lady. Another fabulous altar tomb in the northeast corner, again decorated, highly decorated side panels and front panels, probably reflecting the screens. This one here is obviously a church, depicting a church window, and both those tombs are almost certainly the work of the great O'Tunney school of monumental sculpture. Because we have absolutely identical carvings from, say, Johnstown, Grangeforta, and they are bang on, and they're signed O'Tunney works, So on the west, there's just a close-up of the church window from the side panel of the altar tomb, and you can see, because it's been covered over with clay and rubble for so long, every little chisel mark is still visible from the time. Beautiful, beautiful piece of work. A really, really accomplished piece of stonecraft. On the west side of the chapel then, we had the stepped limestone altar, and this is where the chantry priest would have said the Mass twice a day. On the south side, and still, almost certainly still within the Rothe Chantry Chapel, this is on the south side of the north transept now, we were there excavating out the rubble. There's the rubble there. And suddenly this started to appear. So we see 2 feet, and at the sculpture of a very fine gown there. And there's a very happy look in me when the penny drops about what we've actually found there. And what we had found completely buried by all of the rubble was this. An absolutely beautiful double effigy of a man and a woman. We don't know who they are because there was no inscription on it, unfortunately, but it's a really wonderful example of medieval stone carving. She's dressed in a very long flowing gown, and she has her legs crossed, and this is embellished then with these big long ribbons, which are called tippets, and they only come into vogue in the 1340s. So that dates the effigy to, the 1340s, probably around the time of the Black Death, something like that. There's such similarities in the stone carving and in the execution of this monument with things like the Cantwell Fada in Kilkenny and the Bishop Ledred monument in St. Canice's Cathedral. And there's also a couple of others from St. Mary's that are very similar, that they must have all come out of the same school of monumental sculptures. We don't know who they were. It's from the mid-14th century. We don't have their names, but they were very, very accomplished stone carvers. And you can, this is a really, really elegant piece of medieval sculpture. Now, unfortunately, the effigy had settled underneath. There was a burial chamber underneath, and the effigy had kind of settled into it, which caused this crack here, unfortunately. And that's all been fixed up now. And then for a time, it seems that their heads were proud of the floor, or were in some kind of main passageway, maybe an entrance into the Chantry chapel, and people were walking over their heads, and that's why their faces have been kind of polished away. The grave underneath then there's Philip in typical pose. He's excavating the grave underneath the double effigy. This was a really unusual grave in itself. It was a oval-shaped stone and plaster-lined grave. You see there, that's it there. Now, burial, we didn't excavate down into it in any great depth, so we don't know exactly, are the individuals who are depicted in the effigy, are they still in situ in there? But there were certainly remains of timber shuttering and lots of disarticulated human bone in there as well. So they could well be still resting there. And one of the interesting things about the funerary monument, the double effigy, was the fact that we found lots and lots of these Catholic devotional medals from the 17th century on top of the effigy. And for example, these are Italian devotional medals that would have been brought back by people on pilgrimage. They're both of St. Charles Borromeo, who's one of these key figures in the Catholic Counter-Reformation, along with David Rothe. So for some reason, people are deliberately placing, in the 17th century, these devotional medals on top of the double effigy. Now, why? It's hard to know, but they were certainly doing it. The Rothe Chapel were fragments of these lovely blue and yellow glazed tiles. And these were identified by Joanna Wren, who's a clay buildings material expert, as 17th century Portugese Azulejo tiles. They're absolutely beautiful. And if you go to the National Palace in Sintra, and there's the chapel of the church in the castle of Óbidos near Lisbon, you'll find there is an entire chapel that is adorned with just these exact tiles. This is what we have to imagine the Rothe Chantry chapel would have looked like back in the early 17th century. It's a blaze of colour. The walls are tiled with the Azulejo tiles. We know the floor is tiled with these lovely bright green and yellow checker pattern tiles. And the tombs are all painted as well. So you wouldn't have seen any grey stone whatsoever, I don't think. It would have been just all colour. And then the tombs themselves would have had funeral cloths on them. There would have been tapestries on the walls. There would have been, the decorated parclos, the chantry screens, and the sacred vessels as well would have been on display in the church, in the chantry. Now, one of the things we did was we wanted to figure out exactly where these tiles had come from. Were they just, Irish copies of original Portuguese tiles? Unlikely, but there was a puzzle there. So we did this thing called ICP analysis, which basically is a chemical analysis that gives you a very detailed chemical breakdown of what the ingredients of the tiles was. And we compared that then to known chemical compositions of excavated tile assemblages from Portugal and from the south of England. And we got an exact match with a kiln that was producing these tiles in the early 1700s, which was excavated about 40 years ago, and it's on Avenue Los Buenos Aires in Lisbon. So that's to the kiln that produced the tiles that ended up in the Rothe Chantry Chapel of St. Mary's. And similarly with the Normandy floor tiles, again, using the same process, we managed to figure out that they had been produced in a kiln near Rouen in northwest France. So you can see these are the extraordinary lengths that the Rothes went to, to embellish their chantry chapel at St. Mary's. So we'll go now to the east end of the medieval church and go to visit the Shee chapel of St. Mary's. This was dedicated to Our Lady, and the Shees, they're one of the wealthiest of the Kilkenny oligarchy, and needless to say, they got the best spot in the church. So their chantry occupied the whole east end of the chancel. So normally you'd have the high altar here at the east wall of the chancel, but the Shees managed, I don't know how, but they managed to shunt the high altar back here and put their own chantry dedicated to St. Mary in the east end of the church. In 1739 then, if you remember, all of this area here, the chancel is shortened, so these tombs are left out in the open air. And this is just a plan of it. So you can see this is the little mausoleum that was built at that time in around 1739 or so to protect two of the tombs to the Shee family. And you've got the tomb of Sir Richard Shee and his brother here, probably the founder of the chantry here, William Shee, who dies in 1580 something. But by far the most illustrious of the whole lot of them is Sir Richard Shee, who dies in 1608, and that's his tomb right there. He had, according to a contemporary account, a long and stormy life, and he was certainly taking no chances when it came to purgatory. So just before death, he goes out into the marketplace in Kilkenny and he publicly repents his sins. He had loads of them. He's supposed to have been involved in murders, embezzlement, the works. He made confession over and over and over again. He also famously, some years previous to that, he had endowed this almshouse that he founded next door to St. Mary's. And this was for 6 men and 6 women. The 12 apostles. No coincidence. And 6 poor men and 6 poor widows, and they were allowed entry into the almshouse, and they were given accommodation and so forth, but on the proviso that they, no matter how sick or infirm they were hauled out of bed every single morning, brought over to his tomb in St. Mary's, and they had to pray for his soul every day. He endowed a chaplain to say mass then. This is the photograph of the full extent of his tomb. He endowed a chaplain to say mass for his soul here as well. So he had the chaplain paid to say 2 masses a day on his tomb. He had the 12 in the almshouse coming out saying prayers. He then left gold coins for the poor of the city if they prayed for him. And so he basically had the whole town praying for his soul in purgatory to get it out, up to heaven. I wonder, did he ever get there? The magnificence of the tomb itself with the 12 apostles. Again, maybe not a coincidence that he has all of the 12 there. Everyone had their favourite apostle. So he was taking no chances. He wanted to cover all bases. So that if somebody was walking past and they saw St. Bartholomew there, and that was their favourite apostle, they would say a prayer to Bartholomew. There's a few prayers for Sir Richard at the same time. And this is a scan that we had done of the 12 apostles. You can see the beautiful detailing of all of the apostles. there's one on this side and one on that side there. So that's the 12. Yeah. The tomb itself then would have been completely painted, and we can see the guidelines for the painting scheme if you put the lights, kind of raking light onto the tomb. You can't see this in normal light. You put the raking light on and suddenly you see all of this decoration. You can see there's a lion here and all of this foliage. And we have little winged souls and the whole thing, the whole tomb is completely covered and would have been painted to great effect. So where is Sir Richard himself? Well, we think that this is his burial vault right beside the tomb. So the tomb is just over here. And there's this slab here, which brings you down. There's the tomb of Sir Thomas Shee over here. This is another Shee tomb here. And that's the lead coffin I was telling you about earlier on that had been vandalised. So as we cleaned this up, found this stone slab, took that off, went down the steps, and there I am with me. We found a blocked doorway and took out one of the bricks and had a peep in. And this is what we saw. This is a 19th century coffin, and it's got a leather bound with all of these little Japan studs or upholstery. Very, very ornate, yeah, with the cherubs and all the rest of it. And this is the coffin of a man called John Poor O'Shea, who dies in 1859. Now, for some reason, he wanted to be buried in his ancestral burial ground, in burial vault. And when they put in his coffin, they shunted all of the other coffins, one of which may have contained Sir Richard Shee, over to the side of the burial. And there you can see there's a whole series of bones and broken pieces of coffin over on the side of the burial vault itself. But I think that's probably where Sir Richard is buried, and certainly the Thomas Shee tomb is right above it as well. So he might be in there, or he might be in a lead coffin actually within the altar tomb itself. We excavated then an area here just outside the Shee mausoleum. So the Shee burial vault is here. There's Sir Richard Shee's tomb. And we excavated a big, deep cutting here. They needed to put a pile in there to support the extension, the lead-clad extension, which is the Kilkenny room now. And to put in that pile, they needed to go right the way down through all the archaeological levels and down into the firm subsoil. So that gave us the opportunity, the sole opportunity that we had actually to get a full stratigraphic account of the church, the pre-church, what was happening before the church, and all the way up to the modern day. So we ended up excavation down about 3.5 meters here, until we got down to the original river gravels that had come up here. So the River Nore the floodplain of the River Nore had actually originally come up somewhere around here, and at the base of that cutting there we found the original riverbed, which is quite extraordinary. And I'll be talking again about that in a second. So as well as that, we excavated a number of burials here, including one which had been in a stone sarcophagus. These are like limestone, big blocks of limestone which are hollowed out, and the burial is placed in it. Usually the burials are embalmed because the stone coffins are placed above ground level, So, and this one, we only got the end of it. It had been broken maybe in the 17th or 18th century on one side, but this side here, we were able to have a look at it, and it's highly decorated. Can you make out that there, the elevation? So it's got these lovely trefoil arches, and it's got marigolds and lovely little crosses and the like there. And by the time we got to it, the burial, whatever burial had been inside it, had been taken out and placed in a very neat little pile just here beside it. And we took away those bones and they were examined by Dr. Linda Lynch, who's our osteoarchaeologist. And you can see here, can you see these? These are some of the long bones. And can you see those black marks? Lots and lots of the bones that had been in here had these little black marks on them. And we were really puzzled by this. We had no parallels for this anywhere, despite a load of research that we did. And it seems the most likely explanation is that when the body was embalmed, whatever stuff they put into the veins left that mark on the bones. And that's where it comes from, those black marks on the bones. It's literally, when you pick it up, it's like somebody has taken a marker and, drawn on the bones. I did wonder, had my daughter gotten to them before us, but I can rule that out. She promised she hadn't. So I think they probably reflect the veins that were embalmed, filled with the embalming fluids. In these coffins here usually date from the 13th and 14th century. So this is somebody important who was buried in a stone, very highly decorated stone coffin, which was sitting proud of the floor of the church in the 13th or 14th century, up near the main high altar of the church. And this was somebody who had been embalmed as well, somebody very important. Maybe this was a parish priest or a lord of the town or something like that, some worthy anyway. So that's the Shee chapel. We'll head over now to the south transept very quickly, go to the Archer Chantry of St. James in the south transept. We're excavating there, and plan you can see riddled with graves and entrances to burial vaults. We've got burial vaults here. All the brown are graves. There's some of the original floor still surviving there. And this was all topped out. There's our 18th century rubble layer. This had been topped off here by a Victorian heating system. So we took off that after recording, and this is the tomb of Walter Archer that I showed you already. This was set in the middle of the Chantry chapel of St. James. And this was, as well as being a tomb, because he's in a little stone cyst right underneath the tomb, this also doubled as an altar, almost certainly, because it's freestanding within the Chantry. And it records his death and the death of his wife in 1565 as well. And he was a pretty important figure in himself. He was the first MP for Kilkenny, would you believe? Now, if you look here, this is the south wall of the south transept here. And you can see these two holes in the ground here. There's the Walter Archer altar tomb. And these are the entrances to two burial vaults. And fortunately, we know exactly who was buried in them because we have records of Thomas Archer and Margaret Cransborough. Their monument stood until the 1960s right here. And there's fragments of that monument still in the churchyard today. And that's their burial vault, including probably some of their other family members as well. So you go down there and it opens up into a small barrel vault. The monument itself, again, Phil Kenny was using the remaining pieces, was able to reconstruct it as is shown here. So the dark grey are the bits that we have, and the light grey are the bits that we don't have, but are projected from what we do have, if you understand. So you can see, again, it's a very, very fine Renaissance style mural monument. And this was set up against the south wall of the transept, right over the burial vault. We go down into the burial vault, and it's full of, in the Rothe chapel, the coffins were of pine. In the Archer chapel, the coffins are of oak. So these are more expensive, and they've got very, very, very fine iron fittings. And the both of those burial vaults are absolutely crammed with these oak coffins to the Archer family. These all date from, the late 1500s to the mid 1600s. The particular individual who was in this coffin here, there's that, that thing, be buried with my boots on. Well, this fellow was buried with his shoes on, and there's the actual shoes that he was buried in. We had those examined by a specialist in leather and shoes, ancient shoes, called John Nichol, and he was able to tell us that those shoes were never actually worn, that they were specifically made for the burial. So that these are burial shoes. And beside that, then we have another burial vault. You can see the steps going down there. This is on the west side of the transept. Go down into it and you can see, again, big stone burial vault, and it's strewn with human bone. There's children's bones and adults' bones down there. Lots of these burials, and throughout the church, actually, the burials had been limed. So they had introduced lime onto the burials to stop. There have been a lot of complaints, particularly in the mid-19th century, about the smells that were exuding from the floor of the church. So they used to put lime on the burials to, speed up decomposition. In this particular vault here, we also found some pretty gruesome evidence about how the dead were treated by presumably by the church authorities. We found lots of evidence that there was articulated human remains. There was an entire spine, for example, that was sitting just over here within the vault. This means that an individual was taken whilst they still had flesh on them out of their coffin and thrown against the wall of the burial vault. And presumably this was to make room for new burials that were being introduced into the vault. Rest in peace was not big at the time. The last of the chantry chapels then that we'll look at is the chantry chapel of the man who built this great house here, John Rothe Fitzpiers. He dies in 1620. But his will records that, considering the frailty of man's life, and yet nothing is more certain than death, nor more uncertain than the hour thereof, I do make this my last will and testament. I humbly pray the Blessed Virgin Mary and all the holy company of heaven to pray to his divine majesty for the salvation of my soul, and do will that my body be buried in the chapel lately erected and built by myself between the Cross Church and the northern porch of St. Mary's Church in the said city, which chapel I have dedicated to the glory of the Holy Trinity. So there's John Rothe. He's doing two important things there. First of all, he's showing his deep uncertainty with the question about what's going to happen to him after his death in the afterlife. And he's again in the second decade of the 17th century, long after the Reformation. He's obsessing about purgatory, and this is what is tormenting his mind. And then the second thing is he's talking about the Holy Trinity Chapel that he had built. We know that he had built this in 1612, about 8 years before his death. We have a letter which he writes to the Dean and Chapter of St. Canice's Cathedral, where he's asking them for permission to build this chapel. So he's asking for permission to set up a Catholic chantry chapel in a Protestant church long after the Reformation. And the Dean says, yep, that's fine. Just, you know where to leave the envelope. Kind of thing. But this would have been absolutely unthinkable in England at the time. It just would not have happened. So it just shows the power of the Catholic oligarchy here at the time. And the centrepiece of Rhodes, there's just the map just showing you where it is. There's the Chapel of Michael the Archangel, where David Rothe is, and then this is the Rothe Chantry Chapel right beside it. Again, this was all pulled down in the mid-18th century, down to its floor level. The centrepiece of his chapel was his magnificent Renaissance-style tomb. This was moved to its current location from the north wall of the Holy Trinity Chapel in about 1820 by the great William Robertson. Actually was involved in that. And when they opened up the tomb here, they found what they reckon was the remains of John Rothe Fitzpiers in there. No sign of his wife. So the excavations then, we uncovered most of the footprint of John Rothe Fitzpiers' Chantry Chapel. And you can see here, there's the west wall of the north transept. You can see it's very, very finely paved. So the area in front of his tomb would have been all very nicely paved. And we found there's the setting for his tomb right there. And then it looks like there was another setting for a tomb just here. There was at least two elaborate, probably Renaissance style, the second one as well, tombs here in the Rothe Chantry Chapel. Lots of these slabs here actually are uninscribed ledger slabs that are covering stone cists with multiple coffin burials in them. And it's something that I haven't come across it before, where you get these uninscribed. There's no inscription on the slabs. It's not that they were just worn away. There was very deliberately done that there was no inscriptions placed on the slabs. But we got cameras in and we were able to see that there's multiple coffin burials inside under these slabs in cist graves. And we got to examine one of them over here because there was a down pipe had to be inserted into it. And this proved to be really, really interesting. This was in the corner here of the Rothe Chapel. There's just some of the uninscribed ledger slabs. And so there's Philly again in the corner. And this is the stone cist grave. Within it then there was 3 coffin burials. And strange thing about them was their orientation. They were all orientated with their heads to the east, rather than the usual thing was to have the head to the west. Highly unusual. And we got radiocarbon dates on them, and there's a 100-year gap between the first one going in and the last one. The first one goes in the 15th century and the last one in the 17th century. So this seems to have been a very particular, special place of burial within the Rothe Chantry Chapel. Why is there a 15th century burial there, though, is the question. What, is that somebody who was taken from their original resting place and put in here deliberately after the chapel was built? Remember, the chapel's built maybe a century after this individual died. So again, something strange is happening there. The orientation, typically, if individuals are orientated with their heads to the east, it means that they're ecclesiastics, they're priests. And it could be that this was a particular spot that was reserved within the Rothe Chantry Chapel for men of the cloth. Now, all the individuals here were elderly. They were all elderly males, and we got isotopic analysis done of their bones, and they all enjoyed very, very healthy, meat-rich diets, which completely the opposite to burials that we found elsewhere outside in the poorer parts of the graveyard. So John Rothe's Chantry Chapel from 1612 is the very last of the chantry chapels to have been founded in St. Mary's, and this brings to an end about 400 years of chantry foundation in the church. And then at the other end of the scale altogether, we have the poor of the medieval city. And we excavated, some of you might have visited us when we were excavating. There's goods there, there's St. Mary's Lane. And in this area here, we had to excavate about 14 individuals because there was some service trenches that were being brought through that area, and they couldn't be avoided. These remains were, you can see, very, very shallow, just below the paving, and 14 skeletons in total. Our radiocarbon chronology here is telling us that there's two very distinct phases of burial here, one belonging to the 15th century and one belonging to the 17th century. And here it is on plan. You can see their orientation heads to the southwest, feet to the northeast. And again, that's a little bit off the usual, and I'd suspect that they're deliberately orientated like that so that they're facing the high altar of the church. They would have been pointed basically straight towards the high altar of the church. All of these are in the southwest corner of the old medieval graveyard. And here we are, excavation, the individuals. Funnily enough, when we were digging those burials out in the open like this, it was during the Arts Week. And we had, I don't know how many fellas in black polo necks came up, and arty types, and they were inquiring about, wow, that's a really interesting art installation that you're doing there. So of the 14 skeletons, these were all individuals who had died early. Most of them had trauma on their bones as well. A lot of them were teenage girls. We had one individual here. You can see her spine is completely bent. And this was the result of having had years and years of carrying very, very heavy weights. So I don't know, was she working in a quarry? Was she, in domestic servitude or something like that? But she had that very, very severe spinal injury at her death. She died when she was about 15 or 16 years of age. Beside her then, over here, there was a young child, who had a very, very severe iron deficiency, and they possibly even died from starvation. None of these individuals were buried in coffins, but we did find lots of these little shroud pins here. These are copper pins that would have held the shroud together, a bit like in this illustration here. So they're wrapped up in winding sheets, linen winding sheets, and placed into simple earth-cut graves. So that gives us a completely different perspective on what, how the poor of medieval Kilkenny and early modern Kilkenny would have lived. Now, I mentioned earlier on, we're coming to the end now, this cutting that we excavated outside the Shee mausoleum. This extended right the way down through all of the layers of archaeological stratigraphy, from the early modern to the medieval to right down into the natural river gravels. And right, here's a section you can see. So there's current ground level here. And that's the tomb there's the Shee mausoleum. This is like a slice through it all. You can see the red there at the very bottom is the natural ground. And then all of this here is build-up that was introduced after the north wall of the chancel was built. And this is all peppered with burials here, belonging to the Shee family. And then on the other side of the chancel wall, so this is the north chancel wall here. On the other side then we excavated here and found, we recorded and removed about 5 or 6 skeletons there dating from the 15th and 16th centuries. Right at the very, very base of this cutting here, we found something extraordinary. At a depth of 3.2 meters. And this was under the foundations of the north wall of the chancel of the original William Marshall Church. We found the skeleton of a child. He or she had been buried in the Riverine sands deposit. And in fact, they had actually cut into, their grave had cut into an earlier layer, which was refuse, possibly from a corn drying kiln, which had been operating in the 5th or 6th century AD. And that might bring us right back to the very beginning of the story of Kilkenny. It's probably associated with the monastery of Donnoch Patrick that was founded by St. Patrick up on the east side of Kilkenny. And based on the stratigraphic position of this infant underneath the foundations and then the radiocarbon dating that we had undertaken on her or him, they were alive sometime between 1170 and 1200. And this is the very earliest burial that we have from the entire site. They predate the construction of William Marshall's church. Now, we have some inkling that there might have been a chapel on the site before Marshall built his great parish church. David Rothe tells us that there was a chapel founded by Strongbow here. So it's possible that this infant was buried, near that chapel, but they're right on the edge. They're buried right on the edge of the floodplain of the river. And in fact, some of their bones had been lost to the river because the burial was incomplete. Can you see that sort of grey, silty deposit there? That's the old river gravels that date back, over 1,000 years. And then there's the bones of the child. When it was all laid out, you can see some of the spine, the lower jaw, and the skull and the left arm. This infant died at the age of between 9 and 12 months. And they had an abnormally enlarged head. A developmental abnormality, some sort of macrocephaly. It's where the head is abnormally enlarged. And you can see here the skull. This is our infant skull. And that's the same part of the skull from a normal individual here. You can see it's completely elongated. So their head is very, very much enlarged. There was lesions on the skull as well. And the particular type of lesions are typical of meningitis. So this poor little child who died in the 1170s, 1180s maybe, died probably from meningitis. We can't say that for certain. And what we found as well amongst the bones, once we took samples and had them examined by our archaeobotanists, and amongst a number of different weed species and the like, she found seeds from primrose among the bones. So this infant brings us right back to the beginnings of St. Mary's, one of the very, very first interments on the site. About 50,000 were to follow her or him. And so we were very fortunate to find their remains. And it was Philip Kenny who excavated the child. He did an absolutely extraordinary job in being able to uncover the remains in very, very difficult circumstances, 3.5 meters down in the ground, with shoring on either side, very little light, and he did an amazing job. And Philip actually wrote a beautiful poem about this, and if he doesn't mind, I might read it out to you. It's called Burial 31, St. Mary's. We took her up from the river gravel, her river bones, and I saw the meadow before the church, before the town, and how they knelt by their little one, bruised primrose petals laid one by one all about. Isn't that lovely? So the excavations recovered about 4,500 artefacts, as I said, and many of these were found from the Chantry chapels. Lots and lots of coffin fittings, coffin furniture, handles, breastplates, which would have had the name of the individual on them, loads and loads of these upholstery pins that would have decorated the coffins. More than there. Quite a number of the devotional medals, a lot of them from Italy that I described earlier on. There's a couple there, and pilgrim's shell, which exactly, yeah, presumably from Santiago de Compostela. Lots and lots of little ornaments, dress ornaments that would have fallen off people who were attending in the church and may have gone through the floorboards. So things like this cufflink here, very fine 18th century cufflink. Livery buttons, you can see this one, it's a cockerel, and he has a salmon, I think, in his claws there. A finger ring, quite a number of finger rings. Lots of gaming counters as well, so there might have been a bit of gambling going on in. A very nice, lovely, jewelled cravat. This is for a cravat pin, actually. And amethyst, exactly, yeah. And a 19th century Scottish pebble brooch here. So this was all the rage during Queen Victoria used to wear these when she went to Scotland. And it has stones in it that reflect the geology of Scotland. So very nice little find. Lots of military stuff. You know, the church itself was used as a military magazine, an armament store during the Williamite Wars, and we have lots of evidence for military action in the church. We hat pins like this for the shamrock military badges. There's lace shapes as well. These are little things that finish off the laces before there was the plastic things that we have today. Loads of coins, and I should say the vast majority of these finds that I'm showing you were discovered by a licensed metal detectorist who we had working with us on site all the time, Dan Lenihan. And Dan did an absolutely fantastic job in sifting through all the soil with his metal detector. You can imagine as you're excavating inside in a gloomy old church, it's very easy to miss small little objects like this, but Dan was able to pick them up with his metal detector, and it's a great skill in itself that he has. Included amongst the coins was this French 3 sou coin dated 1643, and a number of Nuremberg tokens as well. These are Hans Krinkel tokens. These were used by sort of equivalent of bankers at the time to keep tabs on, they were used as money counters. Lots of window cames. These are the lead. You can see over there on the window there, you got the lead between the glazing. That's equivalent to those. Keys. I like to think that this is the key to one of the doors of the church, of the medieval church. And then this one here is actually a medieval key, a 13th century key, would you believe? Yep. And back to our military stuff. This was a rifle that was actually found inside. It was hidden probably in the 1920s. It was stashed beside one of the tombs in the Rothe chapel in the North Transept. It's a Martini rifle. Might have been used during maybe the War of Independence, and it was stashed there. Who's going to look for guns in a Protestant church? You know, it's a good place. Lead, lots of lead shot as well, lead bullets. Many of these had been fired as well and had probably impacted off the church. You can see this one here is flattened, so it seems to have hit the church walls, maybe during the Williamite Wars or the Cromwellian Wars. Lots of unusual stuff as well. This is a copper alloy disc. It's only about that size, and it's bent, and it's got a little hole in it here, so it's obviously worn as a pendant. But what's unusual about it is it shows the prow of a ship here. Can you see that? There's the prow of the ship, and just here there's a cannon. Can you see that there? There's a cannon. So it shows a cannon firing from the prow of a ship, and maybe this was cut from, a larger battle scene of some description. That was decoration, maybe a chest or something like that. But it's a very unusual piece. I can find no parallels for this anywhere. It's unique as far as I can see. It's possible there was a tradition, certainly in the 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, that if you bent a coin, you could give it as a love token to somebody. And it's possible that this, was deliberately bent like this and given as a love token to someone, and then they wore it around, maybe a sailor or something, and he wore it around his neck, and it ended up in St. Mary's. A moustache brush, an unusual one. Would have obviously had all the little bristles here for cleaning your moustache. And a toy soldier. It's lovely. This one from the Welsh Guard. He's a lead soldier, probably from the 19th century. Huge collection of carved stones, about 300 in total. Lots of fragments from funerary monuments, from the decorative architectural stone that would have been inside in the church as well. But in the main, it's from tomb fragments. Some of it's very, very fine, like this one here. You can see it's a checkerboard sort of thing. It's possible. I can't, again, find any direct parallels for that. Closest I can get is we go back to that. So maybe that was a stone counting table, and a fragment of it ended up in St. Mary's. You see loads and loads of fragments of early modern and medieval funerary monuments. We've now brought the grand total of monuments predating 1650 in St. Mary's. Before we started, it was about 75, I think, and now we're up at about 140. So we now have the second largest collection of funerary monuments predating 1650 in Ireland. St. Canice's Cathedral it remains the first. In St. Mary's is now second. So big collection of funerary monuments as well. And you can see some of the objects are on display now in the Medieval Mile Museum. And these are on loan from the National Museum of Ireland. And it's a wonderful display. The main thing and the main importance of this display, such as this, is that they're in context. So all the objects that are on display were actually found on the site. And that's really, really important. So all of the archaeology that we found, all of the research has informed and has been integrated into the design of the new museum. And really that led to the rebirth of the old church into the new medieval mile museums. The excavations themselves have given us really an unparalleled insight into the archaeology of a medieval church in Ireland. They've given us a really much greater, richer understanding of how the tombs that we knew about previously were set, within their chantry chapels, how their associated mortuary contexts, and it's given us a huge amount of information on how the church was used, its origins, its development, the different architectural styles of it, and so forth. But I think the one thing, for me anyway, the one thing that comes out of it all most clearly from the archaeology is just this really deep-rooted connection between the Old English merchant families of Kilkenny's golden age and their parish church. And it's a connection that continued through the most turbulent times imaginable. So I leave it there, and I'd like to just thank you all very, very much for coming, for listening. And it really was an extraordinary privilege for me to work at St. Mary's. It was a great privilege to be working on this archaeology. It was also a great privilege for me to be working with such an absolutely extraordinary team of archaeologists. My right-hand man, I've already mentioned him quite a few times, Phil Kenny, has to be thanked in particular because none of this would have happened without him. So he deserves great thanks. Kilkenny County Council funded the excavations through Duggan Brothers, who were our direct employers. And I'd like to also thank them and everybody in the Medieval Mile Museum. So that's it, and thank you all very much. So, thank you.